Miss Marple and Murder at the Tennis Club Tournament. Welcome to Mindful Musings. I'm your host, William, and I'm delighted you've joined us today. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment and let me know your corner of the globe. Now, settle in with a warm cup of tea or coffee, find your most comfortable spot, and let us journey together into the world of Miss Jane Marple and the curious affair that unfolded at St Mary Mead's Tennis Club one fateful summer weekend. Chapter 1. The Championship Finals and a Fatal Interruption. The June sun blazed down upon the manicured grass courts of St Mary Mead Tennis Club with that peculiar intensity that makes English summers so treasured and so brief. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a striped canvas awning, her knitting needles clicking a gentle rhythm as she watched her grandniece, young Emily, compete in the junior doubles match. The girl showed promise, Miss Marple thought, observing how Emily anticipated her opponent's serves with a patience unusual in youth. The club grounds hummed with the pleasant sounds of a tournament in full swing. Tennis balls thwacked against rackets, spectators applauded politely, and the tea pavilion did a brisk trade in sandwiches and lemonade. It was the second day of the annual summer doubles tournament, and the championship finals were scheduled for 2:30. Miss Marple had been attending the club's tournaments for more years than she cared to count. Her late husband had been an enthusiastic, if mediocre, player, and she had maintained her associate membership long after his passing. The club held memories both sweet and melancholy, and she found comfort in its unchanging rhythms. At precisely 2:00, Mr. Marcus Wentworth emerged from the clubhouse, resplendent in his official blazer and carrying his line judge's chair. As club president for the past 5 years, Wentworth took his ceremonial duties seriously. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of assured bearing that suggested a lifetime of committee meetings and confident decisions. Miss Marple watched him cross the lawn toward Court 1, where the finals would take place. The competing teams were already warming up. The Hartley Browns against the Morrison Crofts, two families whose rivalry had defined club tournaments for the better part of a decade. Both teams had members who'd been at the club since childhood, their lives woven into the fabric of this small sporting community. The spectator stands began filling rapidly. Miss Marple noticed several faces marked by tension rather than excitement. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley Brown sat rigid in her seat, her knuckles white as she gripped her programme. Across the court, James Morrison's jaw was clenched so tightly Miss Marple worried for his teeth. She found this odd. While competitive spirit was natural, this felt different. There was an undercurrent of genuine animosity in the air. At 2:30, the finals commenced. Wentworth climbed into his line judge's chair with practiced ease, positioned perfectly to call the service line. The first serve thundered across the net, and the match began. Miss Marple continued her knitting, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. She noted how certain spectators kept glancing toward the equipment shed rather than watching the play. Curious behaviour indeed. The match progressed intensely. At 15 minutes past 3, during a particularly heated exchange at the net, someone screamed. Not from the court, but from behind the tea pavilion. Mrs. Dorothy Reeves, the groundskeeper's wife, came running toward Court 1, her face ashen. The players stopped mid-rally. Spectators rose from their seats. Mrs. Reeves was pointing frantically toward the equipment shed, her words tumbling out in incoherent gasps. Several men, including Dr. Haydock, who'd been watching from the stands, rushed toward the shed. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose to her feet. She made her way carefully toward the growing commotion, her walking stick tapping against the paved path. By the time she reached the equipment shed, a small crowd had gathered at its entrance. Dr. Haydock emerged, his face grave, and spoke quietly to Inspector Slack, who'd been attending the tournament off-duty. Mr. Marcus Wentworth lay dead inside the shed, collapsed beside the refrigerator, where players kept their drinks cool during matches. His sports bottle lay on its side nearby, its contents spilled across the concrete floor. Even from the doorway, Miss Marple caught the distinctive bitter almond scent that spoke of poison. The championship finals, she reflected, had been interrupted most definitively indeed. Chapter 2. 6 Families and the Membership Proposal. Inspector Slack cleared the equipment shed and established it as a crime scene with commendable efficiency. The tournament was suspended. Players and spectators asked to remain on the grounds for questioning. Miss Marple returned to her chair beneath the awning and resumed her knitting, though her needles moved more slowly now as her mind worked through what she'd observed. Dr. Haydock confirmed what the bitter almond scent had suggested: strychnine poisoning, a horrible way to die marked by violent convulsions and respiratory failure. Yet Mrs. Reeves had described finding Wentworth's body quite still, positioned almost peacefully beside the refrigerator. That struck Miss Marple as odd. Strychnine victims rarely died peacefully. As the afternoon wore on and the police conducted their interviews, Miss Marple overheard fragments of conversation that painted an increasingly complex picture. The tennis club, it seemed, had not been the harmonious community it appeared. 3 weeks ago, Wentworth had proposed sweeping changes to the membership structure. Miss Marple learned the details from Mrs. Bantry, who stopped by her chair to share the latest gossip. The proposed changes would increase annual dues by 60% and introduce new facility fees. 6. Long-standing families would be effectively priced out of membership. These weren't wealthy people. They were teachers, shopkeepers, civil servants, families for whom the tennis club represented their primary social outlet and recreational space. The 6 families were well known to Miss Marple: the Hartley Browns, currently competing in the suspended finals; the Morrison Crofts, their opponents; the Reeves family, whose patriarch Thomas served as groundskeeper; the Whitcombes, whose 3 children had learned to play on these very courts; the Ashtons, who'd celebrated their silver wedding anniversary at the club last summer; and the Pembrokes, whose teenage son had just earned his coaching certification. All 6 families had attended the emergency membership meeting where Wentworth presented his proposal. By all accounts, the meeting had been contentious. Voices had been raised. Mrs. Hartley Brown had wept openly. James Morrison had called Wentworth's proposal unconscionable. Thomas Reeves had spoken of betrayal and broken promises. Miss Marple set down her knitting and watched as Inspector Slack interviewed members of these families one by one in the clubhouse. Each had the same motive. Each had been present at the tournament. Each had opportunity to access the equipment shed during the busy tournament weekend when players and spectators moved freely about the grounds. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to something more specific. She'd noticed Wentworth arrive at 2 o'clock carrying only his line judge's chair. He hadn't brought his sports bottle with him from the clubhouse. That meant the bottle had already been in the equipment shed, likely placed there before the finals began. Someone had poisoned it earlier, knowing Wentworth would retrieve it during a break in the match. She rose from her chair and made her way slowly toward the equipment shed, now guarded by a young constable. Inspector Slack emerged just as she arrived. He regarded her with the weary resignation of a man who'd learned that Miss Marple's presence at a crime scene was rarely coincidental. "I suppose you've noticed something we've missed," he said without preamble. "Perhaps nothing at all," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Though I did wonder about the timing. Mr. Wentworth was last seen alive at 2 o'clock, yet his body wasn't discovered until 3:15. That's 75 minutes. Yet strychnine acts quite rapidly, does it not?" Dr. Haydock, who'd been speaking with the inspector, nodded grimly. "Typically within 15 to 30 minutes of ingestion. Sometimes faster. The victim experiences muscle spasms, difficulty breathing, and convulsions before death occurs." "Yet Mr. Wentworth appeared to have died peacefully," Miss Marple observed. "No signs of the violent symptoms one would expect. Most curious." Inspector Slack frowned. "You're suggesting the timeline doesn't match." "I'm suggesting that perhaps Mr. Wentworth's death was not quite as straightforward. As it appears," Miss Marple said gently, "which raises the question of when exactly he consumed the poison and why its effects were delayed." Chapter 3. The Resealed Bottle and Hidden Symptoms. The following morning, Miss Marple returned to the tennis club at Inspector Slack's somewhat reluctant invitation. The equipment shed remained cordoned off, but the inspector had agreed to let her examine the crime scene under supervision. She'd suggested there might be details worth observing in proper daylight, and experience had taught him not to dismiss her suggestions. The shed was larger than it appeared from outside, lined with shelves holding tennis equipment, maintenance supplies, and a commercial refrigerator for player refreshments. Wentworth's body had been removed, but chalk marks indicated where he'd fallen beside the refrigerator. Miss Marple's attention focused on the sports bottle that had contained the poisoned drink. It sat on an evidence table, tagged and photographed. Inspector Slack handed it to her carefully. It was a standard insulated bottle, navy blue with the club's logo printed on the side. Wentworth's name was written on the bottom in permanent marker. She examined the cap carefully through her reading spectacles. The plastic safety seal appeared intact at first glance, but closer inspection revealed something peculiar. The seal had been cut and then reattached with remarkable precision. Only someone looking specifically for tampering would notice the hairline discontinuity in the plastic. "Whoever did this had access to specialized adhesive," she murmured, "and the skill to use it. This wasn't a rushed job. Someone planned this carefully." Inspector Slack made a note. "We'll check who had access to such materials." But Miss Marple was troubled by something else. She asked Dr. Haydock, who'd accompanied them, "You said strychnine acts rapidly, yet Mr. Wentworth wasn't discovered until 75 minutes after he was last seen alive. If he drank the poison at 2 o'clock, he should have shown symptoms by 2:30 at the latest. But he was serving as line judge during the finals, which began at precisely 2:30. Several witnesses confirm he appeared perfectly normal." Dr. Haydock stroked his chin thoughtfully. "That is puzzling, unless there was something that delayed the poison's effect." "What might cause such a delay?" Miss Marple inquired. "Certain medications can interact with poisons to alter their pharmacokinetics," the doctor explained. "If Wentworth was taking something that affected his metabolism or cardiovascular function, it could potentially delay symptoms." Inspector Slack consulted his notes. Wentworth's wife mentioned he took heart medication, prescribed by his cardiologist in London. "What type of heart medication?" Dr. Haydock asked sharply. A phone call to Mrs. Wentworth confirmed the answer. "Beta blockers for high blood pressure and irregular heartbeat." Dr. Haydock grew very quiet as he absorbed this information. "Beta blockers can mask many of strychnine's initial symptoms," he said slowly. "The racing heart, the elevated blood pressure. They might delay the onset of visible symptoms by 30 to 40 minutes, long enough for someone to drink poisoned liquid at 2 o'clock and appear normal until well after 2:30. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So our killer knew about Mr. Wentworth's heart medication. They understood that the poison's effects would be delayed, giving them time to be elsewhere when symptoms finally appeared. This wasn't merely premeditated. This was calculated with medical knowledge." Inspector Slack looked troubled. "That significantly narrows our suspect pool. Who would know about Wentworth's private medical condition?" "Family, certainly," Miss Marple said. "His doctor, obviously, but also close friends. People with whom he'd shared personal information over years of acquaintance. The sort of knowledge one gains from genuine intimacy or long association." She turned to survey the equipment shed more carefully. The killer had needed access to poison Wentworth's drink, knowledge of his medication schedule, and understanding of how the two would interact. Moreover, they'd needed the technical skill to reseal the bottle convincingly. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we should investigate who among the 6 families facing exclusion had the closest relationship with Mr. Wentworth. Someone who knew him well enough to understand his medical conditions and daily routines." Chapter 4. The Groundskeeper's 30-year Friendship. Thomas Reeves had been groundskeeper of St. Mary Mead Tennis Club for 32 years. Miss Marple remembered when he'd first been hired, a young man fresh from horticultural college with ambitious plans for the club's landscaping. Under his care, the grounds had become a source of pride, the grass courts maintained to near championship standards, despite the club's modest budget. She found him that afternoon in the maintenance shed adjacent to the equipment room, ostensibly organising supplies but clearly avoiding the main clubhouse where speculation about the murder ran rampant. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his weathered face showing strain beyond the shock of discovering his employer's body. "Mr. Reeves," she said gently, settling herself on a work stool, "I hope you don't mind my intruding. I wanted to express my condolences. I understand you and Mr. Wentworth were quite close." Reeves's hands stilled on the rake he'd been inspecting. 30 years, he said hoarsely. "Known Marcus since the day I started here. He was vice president then, already devoted to the club. We became friends right away. Similar age, similar interests. Our families spent holidays together when the children were small." "Then his death must be particularly difficult for you," Miss Marple observed. "Difficult doesn't begin to cover it." Reeves set down the rake and sank onto a nearby bench. "Marcus and I had our disagreements over the years, but I never thought. That is, I assumed our friendship would outlast any business disputes. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. You're referring to the membership proposal. Among other things. Reeves's voice carried a bitterness that seemed out of character. The proposal would have cost my family our membership, my wife, my children, my grandchildren. Tennis has been central to our lives for 3 decades. To be told we're no longer wanted because we can't afford the new fees. He shook his head. I tried to talk to Marcus about it, privately, as a friend. He said it was just business, nothing personal, as if 30 years of friendship meant nothing. Miss Marple continued her knitting, her expression sympathetic. That must have been very hurtful. It was devastating. Reeves stood abruptly and walked to the window overlooking the courts. But I would never have harmed him, Miss Marple. Despite everything, he was my friend. I've been trying to make the police understand that. I'm sure they appreciate your cooperation, Miss Marple said mildly. Though I confess I'm curious about something. The poison was in Mr. Wentworth's sports bottle, which was kept in the equipment shed refrigerator. You have keys to that shed, do you not? Reeves turned, his face paling. I have keys to every building on the grounds. It's part of my job. But I would never. Of course not, Miss Marple assured him. Though I wonder if you might help me understand Mr. Wentworth's routines. You knew him so well. Did he always keep his sports drink in that refrigerator during tournaments? Always, Reeves confirmed. He was particular about it. Said room-temperature drinks upset his stomach. He'd arrive early on tournament days and place his bottle in the fridge first thing. And his heart medication. You knew about that, I presume? Reeves nodded slowly. Marcus had his first heart scare 5 years ago. Scared him badly. He started taking beta blockers and completely changed his lifestyle. Lost weight, changed his diet. He was very open about it with close friends. Said it was a wake-up call. Miss Marple's needles paused. So you would have known how his medication might affect his response to other substances. The groundskeeper's expression shifted to confusion. I don't understand what you're implying. Simply that the killer needed intimate knowledge of Mr. Wentworth's medical condition, Miss Marple explained. The poison's effects were delayed by his heart medication. Someone understood that delay and used it to create an alibi. Reeves sank back onto the bench, his face now grey. You're saying the killer was someone who knew Marcus well, someone he trusted enough to discuss his health. I'm saying the evidence suggests exactly that, Miss Marple replied gently. Chapter 5. The sale documents and a betrayal discovered. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Inspector Slack appeared at her cottage door looking distinctly uncomfortable, a file folder tucked under his arm. Miss Marple, he said without preamble, I need your opinion on something we've discovered. May I come in? She settled him in her sitting room with tea and biscuits, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. Whatever he'd found had shaken him considerably. We executed a search warrant for Wentworth's office at the club, Slack explained. Standard procedure in a murder investigation. What we found changes everything about this case. He spread several documents across Miss Marple's tea table. They were contracts, dense with legal language, but the essential facts became clear quickly enough. Marcus Wentworth had been negotiating to sell the tennis club property to a development company. The sale was complete, contracts signed and dated 3 weeks prior. Completion was scheduled for the end of summer, with Wentworth personally receiving £200,000 as the selling president. Miss Marple studied the documents carefully, her expression growing more troubled. But surely the club property was held in trust for the community. I remember when Mrs. Alderton donated the land 50 years ago. There were specific conditions about it remaining a recreational facility in perpetuity. That's what everyone believed, Inspector Slack said grimly. But Wentworth had excellent solicitors. They found a loophole in the trust language. The property could be sold if the club's board unanimously approved, and the proceeds were used to establish a new facility elsewhere. Wentworth had convinced the board that the development money would fund a modern sports complex on cheaper land outside the village. Except that wasn't his actual intention, Miss Marple observed, tapping one particular clause in the contract. No, Slack confirmed. According to these documents, Wentworth had structured the sale so he'd receive a consulting fee of £200,000. The club would get barely enough to cover its debts with nothing left for a new facility. In effect, he was selling off a community asset for personal profit. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a soft clink. Did the board members understand what they were approving? We've been interviewing them. Most claim they trusted Wentworth's judgment and didn't read the fine print. Only one person discovered the truth before the murder. Inspector Slack pulled out another document. This is a maintenance log from the club. 3 weeks ago, Thomas Reeves noted in his log that he'd accessed Wentworth's office to check on a water leak behind the filing cabinets. That's when he must have found these documents. "How do you know he found them?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Inspector Slack produced a final document, this one printed from a computer file. It was a letter draft addressed to the local newspaper, dated 2 weeks before the murder, titled, "The Death of Community Spaces." The letter described the tennis club's imminent sale in scathing detail, named Wentworth as the architect of this betrayal, and called for community action to stop the development. "Reeves wrote this," Slack said heavily. "It was saved on the club's computer, the one he uses to manage irrigation scheduling and equipment orders. He never sent it, but he clearly knew about the sale well in advance." Miss Marple read the letter carefully, noting its passionate language and detailed financial analysis. This wasn't the work of someone who'd stumbled accidentally upon information. This was someone who'd discovered a devastating betrayal and spent considerable time researching its implications. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we need to have another conversation with Mr. Reeves." Chapter 6. The confrontation on Saturday evening. They found Thomas Reeves the next morning in his small office behind the maintenance shed. Inspector Slack had brought Sergeant Lake as witness. Miss Marple had been permitted to accompany them, though Slack had made clear she was to remain a silent observer. Reeves looked up as they entered, resignation already settling over his features. He'd known this moment was coming. The only question had been when. "Mr. Reeves," Inspector Slack began formally, "we need to ask you about some documents we've found. Specifically, your draft letter to the newspaper about the tennis club's sale." "I wrote that," Reeves said immediately. "I'm not denying it. I was angry and betrayed, and I wanted the community to know what Marcus was doing. But I never sent it. In the end, I couldn't betray my friend publicly, even after what he'd done." "Tell us how you discovered the sale," Slack prompted. Reeves leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant with memory. 3 weeks ago, I noticed water damage on the wall behind the filing cabinets in Marcus's office. Mold growing on the baseboards. I went in after hours to investigate the leak, moved the cabinets to check the pipes behind them. The sale contracts had fallen down between the cabinet and the wall. I picked them up to put them back, and I saw what they were. "What did you do then?" Miss Marple asked gently, unable to remain silent. "I read them," Reeves said simply. "Every word. It took me 2 hours to understand all the legal language, but eventually the truth became clear. Marcus was selling our club, selling the property Mrs. Alderton had donated for the community's benefit, and he was going to profit enormously while the rest of us lost everything." "Did you confront him?" Inspector Slack asked. "Not immediately." Reeves rubbed his weathered face. "I needed time to process it. I spent a week researching, verifying what I'd found, making sure I understood correctly. That's when I wrote the letter. I thought about sending it, forcing the issue into the open, but I decided to speak to Marcus first, give him a chance to explain or back out." "When did this conversation take place?" "Saturday evening," Reeves said quietly. "The day before the tournament finals. I waited until everyone had left the club, then went to find him. He was in the clubhouse preparing papers for his line judge duties the next day." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "What exactly did you say to him?" Reeves's hands clenched into fists. "I told him I'd found the contracts. I begged him not to go through with the sale. I explained how devastating it would be for the families who'd built their lives around this club. I reminded him of everything we'd shared over 30 years of friendship." "And his response?" He laughed. The bitterness in Reeves's voice was palpable. "He actually laughed and told me I was being sentimental. Said the club was just property, that things change, that I needed to accept progress. Then he said the sale was final, contracts already signed, and nothing I could say would change his mind." Miss Marple watched Reeves carefully as he recounted this conversation. The groundskeeper's face showed genuine anguish, not the calculated emotion of a rehearsed story. This was a man reliving one of the worst moments of his life. "What did you do after he refused?" Slack pressed. "I left," Reeves said flatly. "Went home to my wife and told her everything. She held me while I cried. 30 years of friendship ended because Marcus cared more about money than people." "And the next morning?" Inspector Slack asked, his voice neutral, but his pen poised over his notebook. Reeves met his eyes steadily. "The next morning, I came to work as always, checked the courts, set up equipment for the tournament, did my job, because despite everything, this club still mattered to me." Chapter 7. The Maintenance Log and the 7 a.m. Visit. Inspector Slack produced a bound ledger, the club's maintenance log that Thomas Reeves had faithfully kept for 3 decades. Each entry documented his daily tasks with meticulous detail. The inspector opened it to a specific page marked with a paper clip. "According to this log," Slack said, "you were in the equipment shed at 7 o'clock Sunday morning, the day of the murder. Your entry reads, 'checking irrigation systems.' Can you explain what that entailed?" Reeves's expression didn't change. "Exactly what it says. The irrigation system's control panel is located in the equipment shed. I wanted to make sure everything was functioning properly before the tournament crowds arrived." "How long were you in the shed?" 20 minutes, perhaps 30. I ran a diagnostic cycle, checked the moisture sensors, verified the timer settings." Miss Marple interjected softly. "Mr. Reeves, the equipment shed also houses the refrigerator where players keep their drinks. Mr. Wentworth's sports bottle was in that refrigerator, was it not?" Reeves turned to face her, his weathered features carefully neutral. "I assume it was. Marcus always arrived early on tournament days to place his bottle in the fridge. But I didn't pay attention to it. I was focused on the irrigation panel." Inspector Slack made a note. "You didn't notice the bottle at all?" "I may have seen it," Reeves admitted, "but I don't specifically remember. The fridge is on the opposite side of the shed from the irrigation controls. I had no reason to go near it." "Yet you would have known Mr. Wentworth's routine," Miss Marple observed. "You knew he would arrive early and place his bottle there." "Everyone who's been at this club for more than a season knows Marcus's routines," Reeves countered. "He was a creature of habit." Inspector Slack leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Reeves, we've had forensic experts examine several items from the equipment shed. One of them is your work uniform, the one you wore on Sunday morning. Would you like to tell us what they found?" Reeves's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Traces of cyanoacrylate adhesive," Slack continued. "The same type of specialized glue used to reseal Mr. Wentworth's sports bottle cap. It's not a common household adhesive. It's the kind used for precision repairs on equipment." "I use that adhesive regularly," Reeves said, his voice strained. "For racket repairs, for sealing cracks in equipment, for numerous maintenance tasks. Of course it would be on my uniform." "But the concentration on your uniform's right cuff was particularly heavy," Slack pressed. "Consistent with someone who'd recently been working with the adhesive for an extended period. And the pattern of residue matches handling a bottle capsized object." Miss Marple watched as Reeves's composure began to crack. His hands, which had been resting calmly on the desk, now gripped its edge. A fine sheen of perspiration appeared on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "I also used that adhesive on Saturday," Reeves said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I was repairing the grip on several club rackets. That's documented in my maintenance log as well." Inspector Slack consulted the log. "You're right, there is an entry about racket repairs, but forensic analysis can determine when adhesive was applied to fabric. The concentration on your right cuff is consistent with exposure within hours of the bottle being tampered with, not the day before." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of birds in the grounds outside. Reeves stared at his hands, those same hands that had maintained the club's grounds for 3 decades, now suspected of preparing poison for his closest friend. "Mr. Reeves," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe there's more to this story than we yet know. Would you like to tell us the complete truth?" Chapter 8. The Research Trail and Digital Evidence. Inspector Slack produced a laptop computer, the one kept in the clubhouse for scheduling and administrative purposes. "Mr. Reeves, you have access to this computer for managing irrigation schedules and equipment orders, correct?" Reeves nodded slowly. "Yes, I use it several times a week." "Then, you can explain why this computer's search history shows multiple queries about strychnine poisoning." Slack turned the screen to display a printed list of search terms: strychnine symptoms, strychnine detection time, strychnine and heart medication interactions, beta blockers and poison absorption, all searched from this computer over a 2-week period prior to the murder. Reeves's face had gone pale. Anyone could have used that computer. It's not password protected. The searches were conducted during evening hours when the club was closed, Slack continued. The same evening hours you documented in your maintenance log as being on the grounds for various tasks. And the search history shows someone conducting methodical research, looking specifically for information about how heart medication might delay poison symptoms. Miss Marple studied the search history carefully. This wasn't casual curiosity. This was someone planning a murder with careful attention to timing and effect. Someone who understood they needed to account for Marcus Wentworth's medical condition to achieve their goal. "There's more," Inspector Slack said, pulling up additional files. This computer was also used to access Mr. Wentworth's email account. Someone found his password written on a sticky note in his desk drawer and used it to read his private correspondence. "Why would anyone do that?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she knew. "To verify the sale details," Slack explained, "to confirm that the contracts were real and that Wentworth was indeed planning to profit personally. The email account shows someone accessed messages between Wentworth and his solicitors, messages detailing the £200,000 consulting fee he would receive." Reeves closed his eyes. "I needed to be certain. When I found the contracts, I thought perhaps I'd misunderstood. Maybe there was a legitimate explanation. So yes, I accessed his emails. I read the correspondence with his lawyers, and I realized there was no misunderstanding. Marcus was betraying everything this club stood for, and he was doing it deliberately for personal gain." "So, you began researching how to kill him," Inspector Slack stated flatly. "No," Reeves's eyes snapped open. "I mean, yes, I did research strychnine, but not because I was planning murder. I was trying to understand. I'd found rat poison in the maintenance shed, old stock from years ago, and I remembered that strychnine was a component. I was curious about how dangerous it might be if someone accidentally ingested it. That's all." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Mr. Reeves, you researched the specific interaction between strychnine and beta blockers. That's not general safety research. That's targeted inquiry about how to poison someone taking that particular medication." Reeves slumped in his chair, the fight draining from him. "I was angry, devastated. I wanted to understand how much Marcus's medication protected him, whether it made him more vulnerable to certain substances. It was academic curiosity born from rage, not an actual plan. Yet the sports bottle was poisoned using that exact knowledge," Inspector Slack said. "The strychnine was administered in a quantity calibrated to account for the delayed symptoms caused by beta blockers. The killer knew exactly what they were doing." "And the only person who had all the necessary knowledge," Miss Marple said quietly, "was you, Mr. Reeves. You knew about the medication. You researched the poison interactions. You had access to the equipment shed where the bottle was stored. You had the adhesive needed to reseal the cap. And you had the motive. Everything points to one conclusion." Reeves's shoulders shook. For a long moment, Miss Marple thought he might collapse entirely. Then he straightened, drawing on some inner reserve of strength. "I love this club," he said, his voice breaking. "I gave it 30 years of my life. I watched children grow up on these courts. I saw families build traditions here. And Marcus was going to destroy all of that for money. For £200,000, he was willing to erase 50 years of community history." "So, you killed him," Inspector Slack said, not unkindly. Reeves didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. Chapter 9. The Letter That Was Never Sent. Inspector Slack gave Thomas Reeves time to compose himself before continuing. Miss Marple suggested tea, which was brought in by Sergeant Lake. The groundskeeper held the cup with both hands, as if drawing warmth from it despite the mild summer morning. "Mr. Reeves," Miss Marple said gently, "would you tell us about the letter you wrote to the newspaper? The one titled The Death of Community Spaces." Reeves stared into his tea. "I wrote it 2 weeks before Marcus died. I'd been carrying the knowledge of the sale around like a stone in my chest. The letter was my attempt to do something, to expose what was happening before it was too late. I thought if the community knew, they might be able to stop it." "Why didn't you send it?" she asked. "Because I was a coward." Reeves's voice was harsh with self-recrimination. I kept thinking about my friendship with Marcus, about his family, about the scandal it would cause. I told myself I'd give him one more chance to change his mind, that confronting him privately would be the honourable thing to do. "So, you spoke with him on Saturday evening?" Inspector Slack prompted. "Yes, and he made it clear that our friendship meant nothing compared to his financial gain. He told me the club was just property, that I was being foolish to care so much about bricks and grass." Reeves's hands tightened on the cup. That's when I knew words wouldn't work. The letter wouldn't work. Nothing would stop him except... He trailed off. "Except his death," Miss Marple finished softly. Reeves nodded. "I went home that night and I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the families who would lose. Their place here. The Hartley Browns who'd met as teenagers on these courts and fallen in love over tennis matches. The Morrison Crofts whose grandfather had been one of the club's founding members. My own family. 3 generations of Reeves had played tennis here. My grandchildren were learning the game I'd taught their parents." "So, you decided to act," Inspector Slack said. "I decided Marcus had to be stopped." Reeves set down his teacup, his hands now steady. "I'd been researching strychnine, as you discovered. I knew about the rat poison in the maintenance shed. I knew about Marcus's heart medication and how it would delay symptoms. I knew his routines, knew he'd place his sports bottle in the equipment shed refrigerator early Sunday morning." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Tell us exactly what you did." Reeves drew a deep breath. "I arrived at the club at 6:30 Sunday morning, before anyone else. I retrieved the rat poison from my maintenance supplies. I'd already practiced opening and resealing bottle caps with the precision adhesive I use for equipment repairs. I waited for Marcus to arrive at 7, watched him place his bottle in the refrigerator and leave to check the courts. And then, Inspector Slack prompted, I entered the equipment shed, claiming I was checking the irrigation system, which I actually did. But I also took Marcus's bottle from the refrigerator. I opened it, using the adhesive to carefully separate the safety seal without tearing it. I dissolved the strychnine in his sports drink. The bottle contained electrolyte solution, which masked the bitter taste. Then I resealed the cap and returned the bottle to the refrigerator. The room was utterly silent except for the ticking of a wall clock. Miss Marple's knitting needles had stilled in her hands. "I knew the poison wouldn't act immediately because of his medication," Reeves continued. "I calculated that he'd drink from the bottle around 2 o'clock when he arrived to serve as line judge. The beta blockers would delay obvious symptoms for at least 30 to 40 minutes, long enough for him to appear normal during the start of the finals, long enough for me to be elsewhere, working visibly on the grounds when he finally collapsed. But something went wrong," Miss Marple observed. "He died in the equipment shed, not at his line judge's chair." Reeves's face crumpled. I didn't account for him feeling unwell and returning to the shed for water. He must have realized something was wrong, tried to get help or find something to counteract what he'd ingested. By the time anyone found him, it was too late. Inspector Slack made notes, his expression grim. "Mr. Thomas Reeves, I'm arresting you for the murder of Marcus Wentworth. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence." Reeves stood calmly as Sergeant Lake produced handcuffs. Before they were applied, he turned to Miss Marple. "I know what I did was wrong. I know murder can never be justified, regardless of the provocation. But Miss Marple, he was going to destroy something beautiful, something that belonged to the entire community, and he was going to profit from that destruction. What was I supposed to do?" Miss Marple met his eyes steadily. "You were supposed to trust the legal system, to send that letter you wrote, to expose Mr. Wentworth's scheme to the community and the authorities. There were proper channels, Mr. Reeves. You chose not to use them." "The proper channels would have taken months," Reeves protested. "By then the sale would have been complete. The club would have been lost forever." "Perhaps," Miss Marple acknowledged. "Or perhaps the community would have rallied, found a legal remedy, raised funds to buy back the property. We'll never know now, will we? Because you chose murder over trust in your neighbours." As Sergeant Lake led Reeves away, Miss Marple gathered her knitting slowly. Inspector Slack remained behind, his expression troubled. "He did it to save the club," the inspector said quietly. "Does that count for nothing?" "It counts for the tragedy it is," Miss Marple replied. "But, Inspector, let me ask you this. if we accept that murder is justified to save a community space, where does that principle end? May one kill a landlord to prevent rent increases, a businessman to stop a factory closure? Where is the line? Inspector Slack had no answer. Chapter 10. The community weighs justice and greed. The trial of Thomas Reeves created a sensation throughout St. Mary Mead and beyond. The revelations about Marcus Wentworth's plan to sell the tennis club property for personal profit shocked the community. The disclosure that he would have received £200,000 while leaving the club with nothing sparked outrage. Yet this outrage was complicated by the uncomfortable fact that Reeves had committed premeditated murder. Miss Marple attended the trial each day, her knitting a constant presence in the public gallery. She watched as the prosecution laid out the evidence methodically, the research history on the club computer, the adhesive traces on Reeves's uniform, the maintenance log showing his presence in the equipment shed at the crucial time, the confession itself, delivered with remarkable calm. But she also watched as the defence presented its case. They called witness after witness from the tennis club, people who testified to Reeves's decades of dedicated service. They produced the sale contracts, allowing the community to see exactly how Wentworth had betrayed the club's trust. They emphasised that Reeves had exhausted all reasonable options before resorting to murder. The defence's closing argument centred on the concept of community preservation. Thomas Reeves saw no other way to protect something precious, the barrister proclaimed. He had confronted Wentworth privately and been rebuffed. He had written a letter exposing the scheme, but lacked the courage to send it, hoping friendship might prevail. Only when every reasonable avenue failed did he resort to this desperate act. The prosecution's rebuttal was equally powerful. However sympathetic we might feel toward Mr. Reeves's situation, we cannot accept that murder is an appropriate response to business disputes. Marcus Wentworth was behaving unethically, perhaps even illegally in how he structured the sale. But there were legal remedies available. Mr. Reeves could have sent his letter. He could have contacted the Charity Commission about the misuse of trust property. He could have hired a solicitor. Instead, he chose poison. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was guilty, but accompanied by a recommendation for leniency given the exceptional circumstances. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, acknowledged the community's conflicted feelings. Thomas Reeves, you have been convicted of murder, and murder is among the gravest offences our law recognises. No provocation, however severe, justifies taking another person's life. That principle must be upheld, or we descend into chaos where every grievance becomes grounds for violence. The judge paused, looking directly at Reeves in the dock. However, I also recognise that your crime emerged from a genuine desire to protect your community from exploitation. You acted not from personal malice, but from despair at seeing something you loved being destroyed for profit. The victim's conduct, while not justifying your response, provides important context for understanding your state of mind. The sentence was 15 years, with the possibility of parole after serving half, significantly less than the life sentence that might have been imposed for such calculated, premeditated murder. As the courtroom emptied, Miss Marple found herself approached by several members of the tennis club families. Mrs. Hartley-Brown, her eyes red from crying, took Miss Marple's hand. "It's all so terribly wrong," she said. "Tom shouldn't be going to prison for trying to save our club, and Marcus shouldn't have been murdered for being greedy. How did things go so badly wrong?" Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "They went wrong when Mr. Wentworth chose personal profit over community responsibility, and they went further wrong when Mr. Reeves chose violence over trust in his neighbours. 2 wrongs, Mrs. Hartley-Brown, and neither cancels the other." In the weeks following the trial, the tennis club's future became a subject of intense community debate. The sale contracts were examined by the Charity Commission, which determined that Wentworth had indeed violated the terms of the original property trust. The sale was voided, and criminal charges were filed posthumously against Wentworth's estate for fraud. The £200,000 he would have received were instead used to establish a permanent endowment for the club, ensuring its survival as a community facility in perpetuity. The club's new board, elected by the membership, made their first order of business the removal of the discriminatory fee increases Wentworth had proposed. Miss Marple attended the club's reopening ceremony several months later. A small plaque had been erected near the entrance reading, "In memory of all who have served this community with dedication, may we remember that the preservation of shared spaces requires both vigilance and virtue." She stood before the plaque, her grandniece Emily beside her. The girl had won the junior championship that had been suspended by the murder, the tournament completed finally under new management. "Miss Marple," Emily asked, "was Mr. Reeves wrong to do what he did?" "Yes, dear," Miss Marple replied without hesitation. "Murder is always wrong. But Mr. Wentworth was stealing from everyone. He was being so greedy and awful." "He was indeed. Two wrongs, Emily. Mr. Wentworth's greed doesn't justify Mr. Reeves's violence. But if Mr. Reeves hadn't acted, we'd have lost the club." Miss Marple turned to face her grandniece. "We don't know that. We'll never know that now. But consider this. Mr. Reeves wrote a letter explaining everything. If he'd sent it, the community would have learned the truth. The Charity Commission would have investigated. Legal remedies existed. But Mr. Reeves didn't trust the proper channels. He didn't trust his neighbours to do the right thing once they knew the truth. And so, he took a life." "Is that the real tragedy?" Emily asked quietly. "That he didn't trust us?" "That's part of it," Miss Marple agreed. "The other part is that Mr. Wentworth betrayed the trust placed in him as club president. He was supposed to be a steward of community property, and instead he saw an opportunity for personal enrichment. His betrayal created the circumstances that led to his own death." They walked together toward the courts where matches were resuming under sunny skies. The club would survive, Miss Marple reflected, but it would forever bear the scars of what had happened. Wentworth's greed had nearly destroyed it, and Reeves's desperate solution had cost him his freedom and a man his life. As they reached the spectator stands, Miss Marple settled into a familiar chair and withdrew her knitting. Life would continue at St. Mary Mead Tennis Club. Children would learn to play on these courts. Families would build traditions. The community space would endure. But it would endure with the knowledge that its preservation had come at a terrible price. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important lesson was recognizing that good ends could never justify evil means. The tennis club had been saved, but not by Thomas Reeves's actions. It had been saved by the community's response once the truth about Wentworth's scheme came to light through the trial. The proper channels had worked eventually. But by then, one man was dead and another was in prison. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the afternoon sun, counting stitches as she counted the cost of pride, greed, and the tragic belief that violence could solve what patience and community action might have resolved peacefully. The tennis club stood as testament to both what could be preserved through vigilance and what was lost when that vigilance turned deadly. The end. Thank you for joining me, William, here at Mindful Musings, as we've journeyed through this tragic tale of community, betrayal, and the terrible price of taking justice into one's own hands. I hope you'll return for our next mystery. Until then, take care and remember that even in the darkest of circumstances, there are always proper channels for justice. One need only have the courage and patience to use them.